Hi, this is Greg Quill with John Broughton on Retrospectives on 3SER KC Radio.
Rising moon and silver road behind me, and I do believe the sky's about to fall.
I just had a refresher, actually. I was just back in Australia in September, so I sort of retraced some of my musical roots back to Melbourne.
Oh, excellent.
So, yeah.
Okay, we'll cover a bit of history first before we talk about what you're up to now. Growing up, when did music start to become a major interest for you?
Oh, God, I guess in late high school, 14, 15, 16, I guess, was when I first started learning guitar, and the first time I performed in public, I think, was a sort of sixth form high school rally of some kind. I remember writing some silly song about the teachers, and all the kids loving it. So that was in high school.
Was there
after that? I mean, it was all through university. Of course, it was the singer-songwriter boom period, and I got active in sort of folk. Well, I just followed folk music. It was what everybody listened to, and I ended up establishing with some friends a little folk club on the way out in the North Shore of Sydney, called the Shack, which lasted for about 4 years and 4 or 5 years, and became sort of one of the preeminent folk haunts of Sydney during the late 60s and very early 70s. And I played there, I managed the place. It was a sort of folk cooperative, and everybody who performed on a particular evening got to share in the door takings. It was never more than a couple of bucks, but it was we had some great performances there.
Who would have been some of your earliest musical acquaintances there on that scene? Yeah,
it was. I mean, Marion Henderson used to play there, and it was going way back. Gary Greenwood, Mike, what's his name? Mike, singer-songwriter. Anyway, there were some very. All the stars of the sort of folk period played there over 4 or 5 years.
You recall being terribly ambitious in those days?
No, I never was ambitious. I never was ambitious in anything, actually. I was. I had never made up my mind I really never did make up my mind what I was going to be. I always seemed to land in a position where choices were already made for me, and I wasn't particularly ambitious, no, and certainly not to be a musician, because I saw so many musicians around me who were, infinitely better in terms of technical skills and their command of their instruments and so on. I never seemed to have the gift to become a musician more than to be an accompanist. But things just sort of happened. It was while I was playing at the Shack that one night this guy came down, and he was a music publisher, and he came back a few times, and he approached me about signing a publishing contract, which I knew nothing about, and I thought, might as well. He said he could maybe get some of my songs recorded by other people, and I had absolutely nothing to lose. But the result was that I ended up doing a demo, which became an album for EMI on the Harvest label, which was the Fleetwood Plain album, and like all of a sudden. I had a sort of regional radio hit with that song Fleetwood Plain, and other people were recording it, and there were a couple of sort of guys that I used to play with in the folk club. We just sort of formed a trio, and pretty soon we were out and playing. It all happened very quickly, and it wasn't an ambitious act at all.
Now, you've been working as a journalist for a number of years over there, but you journalism experience goes back even further. You worked on the old Go Set magazine, didn't you, for a while?
I did, yes. For, I guess it was about a year and a half. Straight after I came out of university, I applied for a job. I'd heard that there was something going at Go Set, and it was, I was not familiar at all with the magazine, but I imagined that if I had a career anywhere, it was going to be in writing somewhere, because that was what I developed. The only real skills I had were as a writer, and this seemed to provide a link between writing ability and my interest in music. Although it was pop music, and I had really no time for pop music. But anyway, I ended up getting the job as the New South Wales feature writer, or whatever it was, reporter. And I met David Elphick. He was the managing editor then at the time of the New South Wales edition, and got in the Go Set fold, and quickly learned how to write about how to deal with celebrities. Which actually that was a very important element of the training I do now, because training for what I do now, because for the 15 to 16 years I've been working at the Star, I've been working in the arts area, first as a music critic, and then as television critic, and now as senior features writer. And I think I have an edge that a lot of other people don't have, that harks back to the Go Set years, where I, at a very young age, was thrown into situations where I had to get real and affecting stories out of celebrities, and to discern, to make contact with them on a sort of a real and human level, and I think that served me well.
Did it work the other way as well? I guess having that background at Go Set, did that help you in later years when you're a musician, recording, performing musician, help you dealing with the music press?
Oh God, not really. I didn't really have much to do with the music press, or the music press never had much to do with me during the country radio years. Anyway, Go Set. Go Set was a help initially. I mean, when the Fleetwood Plain album came out, I remember David Elphick wrote a little story about me in a paper and put my picture in Go Set, and that was just at the time it was more promotion for Go Set than launching a career in music. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, Go Set was a very pop. It was entirely pop oriented, and we were what we were doing was very much on the fringes of pop music. It was not. They didn't deal with folk music or fringe music in any way. And then, when Go Set folded later on, I think I only did one or two interviews with any of the Australian music presses. I remember one was with the Daily Planet, and I think there was one with Go Set much later on, but that was about it. So it didn't really help in terms of my belonging to a particular musical, journalistic fold. It was not that much of a community. Actually, it was quite insular and parochial, and even in Go Set, the Sydney and Melbourne offices had an amazing degree of autonomy. Often the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. So.
How did country radio eventually evolve? Because you had started a recording solo beforehand.
Well, and from those sessions, I started out with Chris Blanchflower, who was from the folk scene as well, and he played harmonica. It was probably, and he came from Britain, and he was an incredible harp player. As there are two kinds of harp players. Don't want to get too arcane, but there's the straight harp, which is mostly blowing, and you play in the key in which the song is set, and there's the cross harp player, which is mostly sucking, and which is in a related tuning, and that's mostly the blues style harmonica. Chris was probably the best straight harp player that I'd ever heard, and he used to hang around in England with, oh God, some incredible people, including Rod Stewart at one stage, I believe, when he was in his very early folky years. And anyway, so I had Chris, and Chris provided color and all the sort of accompaniment that I needed in the folk setting. But within a very short time, we were thrown into situations where we had to compete with other bands. Of course, we were more on bills with bands with electric instruments and drums and bass guitars and the stuff, and just to be heard. I ended up. We went through a period of trying bass players and drummers, and I ended up with Tony Bolton, who was an incredible drummer. We still had Chris and a couple of guitars, but around that time I'd been sort of toying. I've been listening to a bit of American and British folk rock, which is making its presence felt, and there were elements in there, steel guitar and mandolin, which I really wanted, and unfortunately I couldn't find anybody who could play either one, let alone both, until somebody told me about this guy in Melbourne called Kieran Tolhurst, who he knew played, who everybody knew played lap steel, and I talked to Kieran on the phone, and he said, "Oh, I play a bit of mandolin too," and he came up to Sydney for an audition, and sure enough, he played dynamite steel and strummed convincingly on mandolin. Little did I know until actually about 3 weeks ago, he told me the story for the first time, that he never picked up a mandolin in his life. And when I told him I wanted a mandolin player, he borrowed a mandolin from a friend, and he got a lift up to Sydney from Melbourne with our roadie, and taught himself 2 chords on the mandolin, which were the 2 chords he played for me on a jam session with the band. And they were also the 2 chords that are the sort of signature intro to Gypsy Queen. So the following week he taught himself to play mandolin. By the time our first gig came up, he was more or less he'd learned to play it. Anyway, it was by then. So and Karen brought in John Boyce on bass, and John was a Melbourne bass player whom Karen had admired, and because I'd really admired Karen's musical taste and ability, I trusted him, and with John and Karen and Tony Bolton and myself and Chris Blanchflower and the pianist, we picked up a pianist in Sydney, John Bird from the Sydney sort of blues scene. That was it. I had all the color and drive, and I had every color of the rainbow then, and that was the band. That was it. It was heaven on a stick for me.
11 on Tuesday. Like you knew pretty much in advance the sound you were chasing there.
I didn't. If you'd asked me back then what I was after, I would not have been able to articulate it. But I wanted a band that had lots of strings and strumming in it, but also had the color and versatility that the piano added, and the harmonica had become so associated with my voice that it was almost like there all the time. It was a bit of a luxury because that's all Chris did was play harmonica, but it was. It was a defining sound. The mandolin, the steel, and the harmonica were the defining sound of country radio. And by the time we'd done a bit of recording and a lot of touring, I knew that was a very special combination and that nobody could duplicate it. And when Karen left the band in 73, 74, I've forgotten exactly when, to form the Dingoes, I was heartbroken because he took 2 of the 3 instruments that really defined the quality of the band, and I knew we'd never get it back again because that combination was just too special.
You have a particular strong memory of any particular thing from the Australian music scene of the 70s, particularly around the time when Gypsy Queen was successful for you?
Oh, God, yeah. I remember the Sunbury Festival. I've forgotten what year it was, but it was in there somewhere, 72, 73, I guess. It was that big one that it blew everybody's expectations out of the water, and it was.
Yeah, I think you played at 73.
Yeah, 80,000 people there or something. anyway, I'll never forget that because, I mean, everybody in the Australian rock business, anybody who had a touring band at that time was on the bill, and it was a fairly chaotic sort of assembly. But it was the first time that everybody got a chance to hang out together and listen to each other play at close range. But in such incredible circumstances in this huge kind of paddock valley, and I remember when we went on, everything was running late that day, and we didn't get on till sundown, which was sort of hours later than we were supposed to, and I think it was just a special moment. It was because we were playing this very sort of gentle, acoustic, ringy mandolin music with lots of sort of romance in the lyrics. It happened right at sundown with a rather spectacular sunset, as I remember. But I remember after a couple of songs, looking out and seeing 80,000 people standing up and screaming and waving and clapping, and I thought the stage was on fire or something. I remember turning around to Karen and thinking, what the hell's going on, But it was for us, and it was just a moment, one of those moments that just happened. You could never plan it, and that was certainly memorable. There was another time later sometime much later actually, when we were between gigs, we were on the road from somewhere to somewhere, and I think in northern New South Wales or somewhere. We had a night off, and we were driving through this town, and we'd heard that there was the local television station was putting on a telethon to raise funds for some local charity. So we had the night off. We wanted to play anyway, so we offered our services. And there were beer and a couple of bottles of wine. Anyway, by the time they came to get us to go on stage for this live telethon, the band had got into the makeup, and everybody was dressed. It was made up in sort of harlequin, all kinds of bizarre makeup, and some of the guys had gotten into ladies' dresses and tutus, and everybody was roaring drunk. And I remember the producer put his head through the door, took one look, and said, "I don't think we'll be needing your services today." That was the day, as Karen refers to it, the day we turned into the Gypsy Queens. There were lots. There were a million times. I mean, the country radio, it was such an unusual band. I mean, the characters were so strong. I don't remember many fights. Nothing out of the usual. It was a very close band. And we just loved to play. We just lived to play in those days. It was, and of course, you didn't have much time for anything. It was just, you had to work to stay alive, and it was just, just a lot of work and a lot of really, there were too many things to single out.
Was it your choice?
Somebody, no doubt, will remind me of.
Of course. Was it your choice in the end to fold up the band and go back to a solo career?
Yeah. Yeah, it was. I mean, I'd really run out of options. After Karen left, John Boyce stayed on with me for a while, and we went through a period of trying other guitar players to see if we could change it. We got rid of the piano and the harmonica after all those years, and we thought we could add a couple of guitars and do a 3-guitar thing, but we couldn't. We just couldn't find the right chemistry. And we tried, and we recorded with. We did a few records. One with Les Stackpole, who was a legendary guitar player. But he was one of those guys where unless all the stars were lined up right, it just wasn't magic for him. And it was the same. Whoever we tried, it was so inconsistent that I decided to. I had a bunch of songs, and I didn't want to blow them unless I had the dream band. Well, the dream band actually happened on the Outlaws Reply album. That was by then the band was kaput, and I'd virtually stopped playing. But Karen and John Boyce came up from Melbourne and said, if you get a record deal, we'll put the dream band together for you, and we'll just do this. We'll do the album, and it'll be the best album you can do. And it was. I mean, it really was. It was basically country radio with some session players and. We hand-picked session players and an incredible producer, John Sayers, and I think that album was it's certainly the high point for me. I mean, it was an artistic epiphany, and it was all because of Karen and John and Tony. They just put their hearts into it and made it happen. If I could have taken that band on the road around the world, I think we'd have conquered the world.
Yeah.
By then the Dingoes were in full swing, and it was a time to turn the page, start somewhere else.
What was the initial attraction to taking music to Canada?
Well, I had that album, and I had, well, good. Actually, that's a good question. The Flying Circus, with whom I had been friends and whom I'd known years before, had gone to Canada in about 71, 72. As the result of winning a Battle of the Sounds contest in Australia, and they'd settled here, and they'd done a couple of albums for a major label, and they'd for EMI actually, and they had done well, and I'd kept in touch with their manager John Sinclair and their bass player Terry Wilkins, and it seemed like a good place to base yourself in North America, particularly because it was very difficult for bands to get green cards in the States. But Canada in those days, was a good base place. So that's where I had my eyes set. Now I could have stayed in Australia and worked the Outlaws Reply album, but I'd received a grant from the Australian Council for the Arts to travel overseas, and there was basically I had to use it or lose it. So Tony, my drummer, and I came here and started up again, and we tried through till the 78, I guess, and by 78 we had Sammy C. was in the band from the Flying Circus, and Chris Stockley had joined us from the Dingoes, who had split up in the meantime, and Tony and myself, and we had an Australian bass player, Bruce Worrell, who had been in Sherbet with Sammy many years ago, and that was the band that toured Australia in 78. And we were supposed to come back here because we had a record deal with Warner Brothers pending, but once all the guys got back to Australia, they decided they wanted to stay there, and my adventure over here hadn't really even started, let alone concluded, so I came back alone.
Was it a tough decision to eventually decide to leave Australia?
Yeah, it was. It was very tough, and artistically, I'm sure I made the wrong decision, because try as I did until 1983, when I finally put my guitars away, I could not put together anything that made me happy, and the reason was that I had so far distanced myself from my roots and my cultural origins and the kinds of yarns and myths and stories and styles and ideas and sensations that make Australian music unique, and about which I'd taken for granted in my entire musical career up to that point. I distanced myself so far that I lost all focus, and all I was trying to do was write songs for the radio, and that's a loser's game. So I turned my back on it and went back to journalism. And by then, of course, I had a wife and a baby girl, so it was also a matter of practical necessity.
Can you just give us a run through of your work over there since putting the guitar away?
Well, In 82, while I was still playing, I was editor of a national music magazine, which no longer exists, but it was called Music Express, and it was a very good magazine. It sort of, yeah, and for a few months after its demise, I was editor of another national lifestyle magazine called Graffiti, which didn't last long either, but that's got nothing to do with me. Around the same time, the Toronto Star I was writing freelance reviews of music concerts for the Toronto Star, and ended up coming to meetings and writing and suggesting and writing features about not just music, but the music culture and culture in general, until finally they offered me a full-time job, and that was at the end of 1983. And I came on as a music critic, and I did that for about 5 years, and until my interest in music and the music of the time. This would have been late 80s. It was beginning to wane, and in 89, when the job as television critic came up, I opted for it because I think and still do believe that television is probably the most powerful cultural influence we have. And I was the Star's TV critic. The Star is the biggest the biggest urban daily in Canada. Its readership's about 700,000. Its circulation is about 700,000 a day and 1 million on weekends. It's a very big paper, and it was so. I stayed as television critic until about 2 years ago, and then was promoted to senior arts writer. Now I write features about whatever takes my fancy in the culture at large, whether it's music or television or theatre or literature. It's probably the most rewarding job in any paper.
Having worked in both fields and with people in both fields, have you found journalists have a better appreciation and understanding of musicians, or vice versa?
Well, I don't think musicians. Well, okay, going backwards, I don't think musicians have any kind of understanding of journalists. I think journalists to most musicians are either sort of weasels if they don't like them, or star makers if they do. Generally, journalists don't have much understanding of the music of musicians either, and I think that was an edge for me too, because having been a musician, I could relate with musicians on a very, very personal and artistic level, and I could tell stories. But first of all, they would trust me. It was almost a sort of an instinctual thing. Most musicians sense that I know what I'm talking about. So there was an element of trust, and when there's trust, they were more forthcoming than they would be with a journalist who is just off the city desk. But also, I was able to frame stories in a way that led readers into an insight of it sort of illuminated the musician's life for readers, which I still think is an edge that I have. It was just fortunate, actually. Again, that was something I fell into. It was not something that I planned. You go where your skills take you. I think I don't know what some famous psychologist said once. What you're doing when you're 40 is probably what you were meant to do all along.
Yeah. Do you pull the old records out from time to time still?
Oh yeah, actually. Yeah. Well, I didn't for the longest time. I didn't for about 15 years. It was too painful. I would, to listen to those records. It was a very intense thing for me, and I would have to actually, when I wanted to listen to them, set aside time in advance. So I knew that I could sort of lock myself away, because whenever I listen to the records, they transport me to times and places, and to the origins of the feelings in which they were born. And I hope that's not too highfalutin, but those songs are all born out of some kind of emotional process. Yeah. and sometimes it's very very intense to go back there, and I could never do it. I could never listen to my own music lightly. So I would say I didn't listen to anything at all for about 12, 15 years. But you know what? I went back to Melbourne for the first time this September. I went back for the first time in 21 years.
Wow!
Since October 1978. And I met up again with Chris Stockley and Karen and Joe Camilleri and people I hadn't seen, but people whom I knew way back then. And they were so welcoming and so. I mean, to them. To them, I'm always Greg Quill from country radio. They don't know what I do in Canada, nor do they care. So when I came back there after 21 years, it was to them it was like I'd just been away on a tour for a long time. And it was it was only 24 hours before the guitars were out and the mandolins were, and we were singing all the old songs and the sort of vitality and strength that comes from that was just amazing. So ever since that trip, which is just over a month ago, I've been listening. I picked up some of my old records there. I didn't even have a complete set of my old records, so I picked up everything I could find, and I've been playing it constantly, and it's been a source of incredible pride and energy and just emotional satisfaction. It's like the two halves of myself have come together again. It's very satisfying. I know this. I mean, it's just a very satisfying space I'm in right now. It's wonderful.
That's a lovely story. Do you still pull the guitar out at home from time to time for your own enjoyment?
Right at the moment, as I said, I lock my guitars away for the longest time, until this trip. I mean, I just didn't play them, and I'd lost my chops. In April, a friend of mine called me up from Australia and suggested that I come out there and do a couple of concerts, because he felt that the nostalgia. I mean, there would be enough people to remember, and I could come back and get around the country and have a good time and. All of that, and I refused because I honestly, I just couldn't. I didn't think that I could, that my chops were there, and it would take me, the best part of a year to get them back, and to what end? Just to be a sort of the musical memory of the month for aging baby boomers. I just didn't want to do that. It was sort of musically dishonest, professionally dishonest, artistically dishonest. But since this trip to Melbourne, I've got all my guitars out and I've been playing them every day, and my chops have come back like absolutely amazing. It's all there, and it's been quite a trip. The last couple of months have been a turning point for me. So I may well be writing some songs again. So.
So it's not totally out of the question. We may see you back on our stages.
I don't know about the stages, but I may put something on record and just for fun, just because I can. There's no.
You don't have to.
I have to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just something. There are certain things you can only express in song, and I've just rediscovered that.
And as well, we keep our fingers crossed for that. That would be wonderful. Okay, Greg, look, I won't hold you up anymore. I'm sure you've got some work to get back to there. It's been a real treat catching up with you. Fantastic
thank you very much.
To you. If you had the whole time over again, what one thing would you do differently?
Geez. I would have been more earnest in the early days of the band to consolidate our relationship. I probably would have listened to Karen more than I did. Karen Tolhurst I've learned in the intervening years, had an incredible amount of good taste and prescience and an instinct for music that I because I was musically naive, I didn't have the patience to deal with, and I wish I had.
Fair enough too. Okay, Greg. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Much appreciated. We'll catch up with you soon, hopefully.
You're welcome.
All the best.
Bye.